Hello, welcome to lesson 6.02. Today we're going to talk about the cranial bones. We said the skull is divided into two divisions, cranial bones and facial bones. So the facial bones are what you think of as making up your face. The cranial bones make up the top of the head. There are 8 of them. This video is going to be a little different. Instead of having one sheet that we label out completely, we're going to be changing sheets because in order to see a lot of the bones on paper, what we need to do is we need to look at different views. In addition to learning the bones, we're also going to be learning the landmarks. And I'm going to be writing, I'm going to match the color coding of these sheets. And you got your sheets color coded. So let's go ahead and get started. The good news is that a lot of these bones match the regions, the body regions that you already know. Now, when I'm writing on the bones, I will write in black because the same color on the same bone doesn't always show up. So we're going to call this bone number 1. And bone number 1, come over a little bit, is the frontal bone. So I'll write in the same color ink. Frontal bone. So when we go through subsequent sheets, I'll just write a 1 on the frontal bone, but it'll continue to be orange. So we have 2 landmarks that we want to learn on the frontal bone. And I'm going to put an A. We have one on both the left and the right side, so I'll indent that. So this is where having your terms of direction down really is going to help you, because what we have here, we learned in the last chapter, is a foramen. It's a small hole. And you have a nerve bundle that passes out through this hole. It's above the eye, and we know the eye is orbital, and we know above could be epi or hyper or supra, and in this case, we're going to use supra. So because of that, we call this the supraorbital foramen. Supraorbital foramen, Supraorbital. And the frontal bone is considered to be a flat bone. Even though we have these ridges here, it's one of the bones that makes up the orbital cavity. So you can see we've got several bones that come together and they join or articulate to make that orbital cavity. We really don't see too many of the other bones, so I'm not going to label it on this sheet, but what we have peeking out here, this little pink, on the next sheet, we're going to label as the parietal. The purple is the temporal. And this dark blue, let's go ahead and do that guy now. So it's going to be bone number 5. I'm going to put a 5 here. Now, it's the same bone. We don't have a left and a right. There's only one of these, and there's only one of these. So bone number 5, and we're going to do more details on that on different sheets, is the sphenoid, S-P-H-E-N-O-I-D, sphenoid bone. But here we see it peeking through the back of the orbital cavity. Okay, that's it. Everything else is a facial bone, so we're going to do a lot of noting on facial bones. All right, let's go to the next page. So let's switch. All right, here we get into our first pretty big list. So again, I'm not going to rewrite out frontal. I'm just going to label it with a number 1. Well, actually, this time I am 1, because I have a landmark. So here's my frontal. And if I go with a letter B, right here, I have a ridge. And that ridge is called the glabella, G-L-A-B-E-L-L-A. I think there's 2 L's. Hope I didn't just spell that wrong. And this is what you think of when you think of your eyebrows. So your eyebrows grow on top of your glabella. And this, it prevents things from coming straight down. It kind of gives you a little bit of an arch there. So if something hits your head and it rolls off, it comes off at an arch, instead of coming straight down and cracking your nose. And we appreciate that when we're in the rain. The other thing we're going to be labeling are the joints between these cranial bones, and the joints have special names called sutures. We'll do that last. So let's go to bone number 2. And I gotta make sure I'm on page here 2. And I need my pink marker now. Put my orange marker away. Number 2 is the parietal bone. Parietal. We really don't have any landmarks on the parietal bone, but what we are going to do, so let's go ahead and do these 2 sutures. I'm going to do my sutures in Roman numerals. This is suture number, we're going to call it number 2, and this is suture number 3. So suture number 2, if you think about it, if you had a crown sitting on your head, it would kind of, if it was like a headband type crown, it would sit here. This is called the coronal suture, Coronal, coronal suture. And number 3 is called the lambdoidal. Oops, no B, just LAM. Sorry. Write that out. LAM. No, you know what? I don't know if there's a B or not. Lambdoidal suture. This one's kind of got a weird name. Where's that name coming from? If you look at the back of the skull, so if I'm looking from the back, what we have is the center suture comes down, and this is that lambdoidal suture, and it looks like the Greek letter lambda. So that's where that weird name comes from. But really, the parietal bone, we do have this ridge here. There are some landmarks associated with it, but it's pretty much a true flat bone. And there are 2 of these. What we're looking at here is the right lateral view. So if I was looking at the left lateral view, I would have the left lateral parietal bone. By the way, frontal bone, there's one of those. All right, in green, well, let's do purple next. Let's go to, so bone number 3 is the temporal or temporal, depending on how you pronounce it. And we have 2 of those. Oops, yeah, that's purple. Okay. And we've got several landmarks. So we're going to do this as A. Let's label these all out first. Let's go to B, C, D, and underneath, we can't see, there's one more we're going to do, it's underneath here, so we have to do that on a different sheet. So let's go with landmark A, 3A, 3B, 3C, and 3D. Hope I gave myself enough room. Ooh. You're going to be labeling all of these out. I may not have given myself enough room. We'll see in lab. So what you're going to do is you're going to get a skull in lab, and you're going to have to find these on the skull and label them, because you'll have a practical test. Part of your test will be a practical where you'll have a skull and it will have labels. So 3A, we learned that a projection of bone is called a process, and A and B both have the terms process. A is called the mastoid process, and B is called the styloid process. And the names again come from the way that they look. So let's write down 3A is mastoid process, M-A-S-T-O-I-D process. B is the styloid process, S-T-Y-L-O-I-D. So the mastoid process has a big muscle that attaches here. So and a lot of times these processes are points of attachment. Foramens are often, we have nerve bundles going in and out, or in the case of we're going to see here on the next sheet, the whole spinal cord. But it's a pretty big muscle that attaches, so it's kind of big, it's kind of rounded, and masto is breast, so I guess the early anatomists, who were all guys, thought, oh, it looks like a little tiny breast. styloid, if you write with a stylus, it's a very sharp point. And a lot of our skulls have lost these because they've gotten cracked off because they're so fine and delicate. C is another process. So what you have is when you think of your cheekbone, it's actually made up of three parts. We've got the part here on the zygomatic bone, the part on the maxilla, and here a part on the temporal bone. Because this articulates with the zygomatic bone, we call 3C the zygomatic process. I'll just write onto my parietal bone. All right, finally, we're going to see this is a round opening that goes all the way through on a skull. For you, this makes up your, it's a meatus, and it makes up your inner ear. So because we're looking at this from the outside and ear is auditory, we call this the external auditory meatus. All right, finally, I have this sphenoid is showing up again. So number 5, let's label that out as sphenoid. And now I get my last single cranial bone. It peaks out here, number 6. So we can't see, really we can't see the sphenoid, and we can't see number 6, which is called the ethmoid, ethmoid, until we look at sectioned pictures of the skull. So we have to cut the skull to really see the sphenoid and the ethmoid. One other thing, we're missing one suture. So I don't think we have a diagram that shows this. If you look at the top of the head, so if you look from the top of the head down, so if this is a superior view of the skull, you'd have the coronal suture here, you'd have the lambdoidal suture here. You have a suture that comes down the center that separates the two halves of the parietal. So we probably should have put this next to parietal, but let's just go ahead and do that now. We'll go 1, 2, 3, or this is number 1. This is the suture we can't see. We call this the sagittal, sagittal, sagittal suture. All right, let's move on to the next view, which is an inferior view. All right, so here we have, oops, I need to slide that up a little bit. Let's fix that. There we go. Okay, so what here we have our temporal bone, number 3, and we see some of those other we see some of our landmarks with different eyes now. This is why we talked about the fact that you need to sometimes see this in different angles. And number 4, we get the occipital. So let's go back through. Let's label out what we have. So this is going to be the mastoid process. So this is going to be 3A. My styloid process kind of doesn't show up very well at all, so I'm not going to try to label that. I can't see my meatus at all. Zygomatic process, we can see that much clearly here. So here's that zygomatic process, 3C. And I'm going to relabel that because it is so much more, you can so much more clearly see that it's a process. Zygomatic process. We also get the last landmark we want for the temporal bone. So we have 3D. That would be E, sorry, 3E. So remember, bone number 3 is the temporal. It's the temporal. So 3E is where the mandible articulates with the skull. So you have to have a joint. And so we're going to call 3E our mandibular, because the mandible, mandibular, and it's a depression. So it's called the mandibular fossa. And when you look at it on the actual skulls, you'll see it's just kind of this smooth indent. Well, if this gets misaligned, if you have misalignment between your mandible and your mandibular fossa, you can actually have a lot of pain. One of my relatives got orthodontic work, and they didn't take into account this alignment, and so her jaw hurt all the time. She saw a different orthodontist, and they said, "Boy, she really kind of got screwed up." And she has to wear a lot of hardware now to realign this, actually for a couple of years. If this doesn't align right, your jaw will deteriorate. So it's kind of a big problem. All right, we've got our parietal bone peeking out here, which was number 2. But what we really see here for the first time, number 4, is the occipital bone. Because most of the landmarks we're going to see underneath. We have the occipital bone. The landmarks we want to look at here are 4A, this great big hole, which hopefully you know is going to be called a foramen. 4B is a point of articulation. We have a projection here, and we're going to call this 4D. And then radiating out from this projection, you have lines that go in all 4 directions. And these lines are, we're going to give those a 4C. So let's start with 4A. 4A, and I'm just going to put A, B, C, D, is the foramen. And this is a big one, right? Our other foramens were really small, so this has got, because it's large, magnum. So magnum's a Latin word for large. If you go on the Magnum at Cedar Point, it's supposed to, when it was built, and I was in high school when it was built, it was the biggest roller coaster in the park. So I'm kind of dating myself. But this is where the spinal cord passes from the brainstem down into the vertebral cavity. So that's why the opening is so big. So then on either side of that, these smooth rounded projections articulate with the first vertebra. And we're going to see that it's very common when we've got these round projections on bones that articulate with another bone. They're called a condyle. And because they're on the occipital bone, B are the occipital condyles. Occipital condyles. 4D, I'm going to leave a space for C. 4D is the, it's a kind of a flat projection. It's not a process. So it kind of sticks out from the bone a little bit, and it's called a protuberance. And because it's on the occipital bone, it's called the occipital protuberance. Occipital protuberance, Protuberance. And this together with the lines, so these ridges of bone are called nuchal lines, Nuchallines. These are both points for muscle attachment. So if you roll your head forward, you can feel the muscles attached to the base of the skull. Most of those muscles are attaching here. So you see that each of these landmarks has a function. I feel like this video is getting a little bit long, so I think we'll run this in a part 1, part 2, because I want to spend some time talking about sinuses. I want to talk about the sphenoid. I want to talk about the ethmoid. So we're going to call this 6.02 Part A or Part 1, and I'll finish the cranial bones with a Part 2. All right, to be continued.